So with Hurricane Milton getting ready to hit the state of Florida, in today's video, I want to talk about how the hurricane might actually impact the election in Florida. So we're going to talk about a few things regarding that. The first thing we're going to talk about is if elections could be changed or postponed or canceled or anything like that, because a lot of people are talking about that. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to do is talk about how this might actually impact the electorate. And is there any historical precedent when we come to looking at the impact of hurricanes on elections very, very recently. And we're going to be talking about Hurricane Ian that just happened during the last general election in 2022. So that's going to be what we focus on. Let's go ahead and first, though, talk about, can the elections legally be changed? Now, let's go ahead and look at these election by election. So first, can the presidential election be changed or postponed or something like that in Florida due to a state of emergency or hurricane or anything like this? And the answer is no. This is pretty much enshrined in the Constitution in Article 2. So let's go ahead and see what Article 2 says. So as you can see in the Constitution, Article 2, which deals with the executive, Section 1, Clause 4, you can see that it says the Congress may determine the time of cushing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same day throughout the United States. Now, I had to look up what cushing means. I didn't know what that meant, but it just meant to choose. But according to the Constitution, basically, the election for president has to happen on the same day throughout the United States. This is why back in 2000, when people were asking for a revote in the Florida election because of the debacle in Palm Beach County and all that, it was not possible due to the fact that the election had to be done on the same day. You can't retake a presidential election. So at the presidential election level, there isn't going to be any change. But what about the Senate level and the congressional level? Because if we look at Georgia, we see a situation where Georgia has a general election, but then goes ahead and has a runoff if no one gets over 50% a month after what we deem the normal general election. So how can this be changed, and can it be changed? And really, there's a possibility that it could be. So you can see in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, which deals with the legislature, Section 4, Clause 1, it says, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as the places of cushing senators. So we have two things. One, Congress can change the date as to when they are elected, right? So this is probably not going to happen. But the second thing, and I find this quite interesting, is it says that the state legislatures could do it as well. Now, why I find this interesting is it doesn't mention the governors. So it doesn't mention that the state legislature has to then pass a law and then have it signed into effect by the governor. It just says the state legislatures have to do this. Now, would the state legislature do this in the state of Florida? I mean, they could. There's nothing stopping them. They would have to have an emergency session of the Florida legislature to then change the laws, to then have something that would change the date, or maybe have a vote where you have a runoff or something like that. There could be some kind of change, but that would have to be done through the legislature, and the chances of having any sort of special session for that is pretty much nil. But what about when it comes to local elections, when it comes to state house, state senator, and even many of the local elections we have in Florida? Let's go ahead and look at what the Florida Constitution says about that. So according to the Florida Constitution of 1968 in Article 6, Statute 15, a general election may be suspended or delayed due to a state of emergency or impending emergency pursuant to general law. Special elections and referenda shall be held as provided by law. So as you can see in the Florida Constitution, there's a little bit of wiggle room. So if there is a state of emergency or whatever, there is this provision within the Constitution to say that it can be changed, it can be delayed, it can be postponed, whatever, right? But there is a little bit of vagueness to this as to who does this, because in the Florida statutes and in the Constitution itself, it doesn't really say how that would play out. If there's a state of emergency, how would an election be changed and then called for another date? This is something that's extremely vague in the Constitution. Now, if we look at precedent as far as how this has gone in the past, or if we look at the law in the statutes as far as just replacing a vacancy or whatever, you do see that the governor usually goes ahead and deals with the election of a replacement for somebody who is absent or whatever, with the consultation of the Secretary of State, which brings up another point, which is why Secretaries of State should be elected and not appointed by the governor, because it creates more of a checks and balances system instead of consolidating power, especially when it comes to elections. So as we can see, there is some wiggle room when it comes to the governor in state and local elections. There is a possibility for a special session of the Florida legislature, possibly to deal with U.S. congressional and Senate elections. But what is the likelihood of that happening, especially when it comes to Ron DeSantis and the state and local elections? Is there any reason why they would do it? I don't think so, and here are some of the reasons why I don't think that we'll be seeing any changes in the election. The first one is because the Florida law is so vague when it comes to state representative and state senate and local races as well, we really have a situation where the Democrats could challenge the legality of Governor DeSantis actually postponing elections because it's not enshrined in the Constitution or within law. And I think in this situation, they could have a good legal challenge to show that he did it because he was politically motivated instead of necessarily doing it because there is an issue regarding a state of emergency or whatever. So the question could be, could he just extend a state of emergency forever and then change that election? This probably wouldn't happen. I think Democrats would be on good legal ground to make that challenge. The second thing is that state of emergency. I mean, it's very, very unlikely that this state of emergency is going to last until Election Day. We are still a month out. There could possibly be another state of emergency around Election Day. But as of right now, it doesn't seem like that state of emergency could really be used when it comes to changing the election that is a month from now. So I don't think that's really a possibility or an opportunity for DeSantis to do any changes. So the third thing is Democrats in special elections. Now, this would be a special election. If you moved the legislative elections from the presidential dates to another date, turnout's going to be much, much lower. And Democrats are actually going to probably do a lot better in special elections, especially in Central Florida. Democrats do really good when it comes to legislative races. As a matter of fact, they have a legislative seat right now that was won in a special election by a Democrat that was previously held by a Republican. So it can help and benefit the Democrats, which I don't think Ron DeSantis would want to do. This is the main reason why I don't think he would make any changes. Now, with that being the case and it looking like they're not going to change the election at all, what kind of impact can we see when it comes to the fact that we're not going to really see a change in the election at all, and with the presidential race, we actually cannot see a change because that's just going to all happen on the same day. What can happen with this hurricane and how it impacts the state of Florida? What votes does it impact? Where does it impact? How can it impact the voting and whatnot? Now, I do want to say one thing about how it could impact the voting. One thing that the Republicans have been very, very much of a stickler on in the state of Florida is that ballots need to be in on Election Day when the polls close. And that means, I mean, obviously, if you're in line, that's a different situation. But if you're doing a vote by mail ballot or something like that, it has to be at the supervisor of elections at 7 p.m. when the polls close on Election Day. Now, if there are a lot of people who are suffering from the hurricane and the postal service is not working the best, these can be delayed and a lot of votes might not even be counted. So that actually could have a big impact when it comes to Florida, and especially since Republicans are doing slightly better in vote by mail as far as the percentage than they have in previous elections. I mean, really slightly, by like 2%. So let's go look at the places that could be impacted by this, how they could be impacted and whatnot. And let's first start with the counties that are going to probably see the most impact from the landfall of Hurricane Milton. So before we go on to the next part, an overwhelming majority of the people who come here, which thank you very much, are not subscribed to the channel. We're trying to get to 20,000 before the election, and we're getting very close there. So if you could please subscribe, hit the bell, it'd be great to have you on. And if you want to support the channel financially, you can go down below and become a member. And I also have a Substack that you can go to, votingtrend.substack.com. I go ahead and write there. And I also have the access to my models. Right now I have the Florida one up. So go ahead and check that out as well. Now, if you look at the places that are affected by landfall, you can see when it comes to presidential election results that the Republicans do much better. Obviously, Hillsborough County is a county that Biden won, but DeSantis won it in the gubernatorial race. And if we look at the other counties, Manatee, Sarasota, Charlotte, and Lee, we have very strong Republican counties. Now, when talking about the overall votes for Republicans, or at least registered voters, when we talk about these counties impacted by the landfall, we're talking about nearly 20% of all Republican voters are going to be affected just in the place where we have landfall. So you can see in Hillsborough County, we have 286,000. In Pinellas County, which will suffer as well, we have 240,000. Manatee, 133,000, Sarasota, 156,000, and Lee County, a huge Republican county, 229,000 voters. So as you can see, this will impact Republican voters, but it'll also impact Democratic voters. So Democratic voters in this area, as far as the composition of the overall Democratic registration, is about 17.5%. So it is 2% lower. So it means it will impact Republicans more as far as the overall vote is concerned, but it can have an impact on Democrats as well. So let's go ahead and move inland and look at the impact of the hurricane in these counties, which are more significant counties. Now, there are a number of counties that will be impacted in certain ways. There's going to be some that suffer a lot of wind damage, such as Osceola and Polk. There are others that are going to suffer a lot of flooding, such as Flagler, Volusia, Seminole County. And then there's some that are just going to kind of have a mixture of both, like Orange County. So let's go ahead and look at the Republicans that are going to be affected by this. So of all registered Republicans, 25.1% of all registered Republicans are going to be affected by the hurricane, mostly in these inland areas. And as I mentioned, it could be different reasons. So you can see Brevard County at nearly 200,000 voters that could be affected, Flagler County at 47,000, Lake County at 119,000, Orange County at 219,000, Osceola at 61,000. Now, if we go over to the next one, we see Pasco is on the coast, but chances are it's going to be more affected on the east part of Pasco instead of on the west coast. You have 172,000 voters in Pasco County, many of those Republicans on that eastern part of the county. Polk County would be affected also with a huge 184,000 voter registration for Republicans. Seminole County at 120,000, Sumter at 73,000, and Volusia at almost 160,000 votes. So if we look at Democrats in the same region, we see 25% of their voters are also going to be affected. So it's essentially a wash as far as registration. So you see Brevard County has 115,000 Democrats that will be affected. Flagler a little bit under 24,000. Lake County, 62,000, Orange County, 328,000, and Osceola County, 83,000. Now going over to Pasco, you start getting a little bit more Republican. 102,000 people in Pasco will be affected as Democrats. Polk County has 136,000, Seminole County, 112,000. Sumter, very few registered Democrats in that county at 24,000, and Volusia with a dwindling population of Democrats at 105,000. So as you can see, when we look at both parties as far as a percentage of their voters, there isn't much of a difference, right? The big difference that we're going to see is in the actual raw number of voters, and this is actually pretty important. So let's look at the number of raw voters that can be affected by this. So we go ahead and look at the voter registration numbers of the counties that are going to be impacted, the ones that I just mentioned earlier. You can see Democrats have about 1.8 to 1.9 million voters in that county, whereas the Republicans have a little bit under 2.4 million voters in those same counties. Now, why is this raw number important? Because we have a lot of nonpartisan, non-party affiliated voters, minor party voters in these areas. And if we just come up with the assumption, and it is an assumption, that many of these people who are non-party affiliates just simply mirror the voter registration of those counties, or in this case of that entire region, we do see that a lot of the people who might be voting in this election who are non-party affiliated voters might actually be more Republican leaning, and this can actually have quite an impact when it comes to the election. So how much can this actually impact the turnout? Could it actually help the Democrats, help the Republicans? How can it do that? Well, we don't have much in recent history to look at to determine how the impact of a hurricane can actually impact turnout, but we do have Hurricane Ian that made landfall in Lee County back in 2022. So let's go ahead and look at the statistics from 2022 and 2018, which was just a regular pre-COVID election year, and see how that actually impacted the turnout. So as you can see in Lee County back in 2018, Lee County was 3.4% higher than the statewide total as far as turnout. So it usually performs higher than the rest of the state. However, when we look at when Hurricane Ian was affected, and it impacted Lee County quite strongly, we see only a 0.3% increase. This is a very, very low turnout for Lee County. So we can see here, just looking at this with very, very little data, that it does seem that the hurricane actually did have an impact on Lee County's overall turnout rate. So as you can see, even though it's not huge evidence, it's just one county in one election and one hurricane, it does seem like the voter turnout did drop in Lee County. And people in Lee County even said that the reason for this drop was because of the hurricane. So it can have an impact. And remember, right now, we're dealing with two hurricanes, one after the other, and people are still cleaning up from Helene. So this can be pretty significant, especially to these Republican places along the coast. Manatee County, Charlotte County, Sarasota County, Lee County. This can have an impact. But to end this video, let's go ahead and look at the precinct level results from 2020 and just see the impacted areas, or the projected impacted areas as of right now, and see the geographical layout of it. All right, so if we go ahead and look at where it's going to impact, a lot of people are just saying right here, Bradenton, Sarasota. You do see some models having it as high as the Hillsborough County border with Manatee County, and maybe as low as the Sarasota Charlotte County border, but it's really in this area. Now you do see some blue in Sarasota and Bradenton. There are some places, but most of the places in around Bradenton and Sarasota are kind of more affluent, more expensive houses for Republicans. So most of what you're seeing as far as population are in these areas. The areas here do have some voters, but as you can see, for example, Sarasota, smack dab near the center of it, you don't have that many voters, but when you come out to these precincts, you have significantly more voters. And the same thing when it comes to these areas of Bradenton and Manatee County as well. So this is where the direct impact will be. Now, down here, down south, we can see storm surge, we can see winds. So that is going to be a major concern. Now, the storm surges obviously can affect Port Charlotte and Punta Gorda. It can also affect parts of Cape Coral, and not, the surge will not affect Fort Myers, but you could have some strong damaging winds in these areas that can affect both of these areas. And that's one thing that we're seeing with this hurricane, that the wind damage seems to be to the south and the torrential rains seem to be to the north. So if we look at where the winds are going to go, well, let's look at the track. So the track is basically, if we look at it making landfall in Bradenton right here, going up to Cape Canaveral. So we're looking at this, or maybe up into Titusville. This is where we're looking at right now. Now, these areas south are going to suffer more wind damage. So who does that actually impact? It mostly impacts Polk County, with the exception of some Democratic areas in Winter Haven, Bartow, and Lakeland. It's mostly a Republican area, so that can have a huge impact. When it comes to rains up here, we're talking about eastern Pinellas County, so Zephyr Hills, Dade City, some other places over here will be more affected, as well as when we get further up, the winds can come all the way up here and into the villages, Mount Dora, Leesburg, and other places like that. So these strong Republican areas might have to deal with a lot of rains and flooding. Okay. Now, as we get into the Orlando area, same thing. Orlando seems to be one that can kind of suffer the worst of both, can have strong damaging winds as well as rain. So that's what we can expect in this area. If we look at Lake County, we do see that Lake County is mostly going to be a lot of rain, as well as Daytona Beach, and going into Brevard County, we'll see the same thing. Now, what you do have in both Daytona, or let's just say Volusia County and Broward County, you do have the winds whipping back this way, which actually can cause more damage when the hurricane starts to leave the state of Florida. So overall, we are seeing that there's just going to be a mixed bag of of damage that's going to be throughout, but it's all going to impact the electorate one way or the other. All right, so that being the case, that's how I kind of see everything playing out with Hurricane Milton. Personally, I think it will have a little bit of an impact. It's happening a lot sooner to Election Day than Hurricane Ian did, and we can already see that impacted the election. So we just have to wait and see what the damage is when it comes to this, where the damage is major, who can recover the fastest. But I do think that if I were to bet who this would affect more, it would slightly affect the Republicans more, maybe helping the Democrats in some state House and Senate seats, but I don't see it having an overall change in the overall election. We'll see, but chances are the numbers, the vote by mail numbers and early vote numbers are going to be severely affected by this. We might see a lot more election day voting. We might see a lot lower of a turnout because this is really a hurricane that can affect the just whole I-4 corridor and the center part and even the southwest part of the state. Very, very strong Republican areas. All right, so I just wanted to do a little bit of an update talking about the hurricane, how it can affect the state of Florida. It's a state that I've worked in for 33 years, so I feel very comfortable with it. So thank you all very much. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and make a comment down below if you have any thoughts about the hurricane and what it might do. Thank you all very much. See you all later. Bye-bye.